Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are addressing a question: were the Christians actually persecuted in ancient Rome? Now, the roots of this question are based on a debate, namely the idea that in reality the persecutions of the Christians in ancient Rome would be a myth. Of course, on this video we're going to look at the evidence to try and trace a connection between what we have heard of and what these sources are actually saying. But in order to address how famous emperors such as Nero, Trajan, Claudius treated Christians, and in order to see if these persecutions actually happened, we need to start from the very first historical persecutions that would have happened against the Christians. These are not at the hands of the Romans, they're at the hands of the Jews. The first persecutions against Christians occurred in the Jewish context. Unlike the Pharisees and Sadducees, Christians were not recognized as a legitimate movement within the Jewish world, and the Gospels report the killing of several Christian believers whose testimony of Jesus' divinity was perceived as blasphemous. Some Christian preachers, like James the Greater, were seen as politically dangerous and destabilizing, and again the Gospels report his condemnation to death by order of King Herod Agrippa I. The Jewish persecutions are not, however, only mentioned in the Gospels. In fact, Flavius Josephus, in his Jewish Antiquities, refers to the stoning of James the Just and some followers by order of the high priest Ananias in 62 AD. The attitudes of the Jewish political authority and of the ancient Roman political authority that supervised it appear to be inconsistent, and most importantly, contradictory. In fact, we could say that Ananias' actions were harshly criticized by both King Herod Agrippa II and the Roman procurator Lucius Albinus. According to Flavius Josephus, Ananias himself, in his condemnation of James and his followers, apparently took advantage of a temporary power vacuum caused by the death of the previous Roman procurator, Porcius Festus, proving that the Romans tried to limit religious conflict and consequent disorders in Judea. Having established this, when would be the very first account within historical record of Christian persecution at the hands of the Romans? Well, this is still highly debated in academia, but the first possible reference would be during the reign of Emperor Claudius. Now, this is something that I have already covered on my dedicated video to Jesus' historicity, which would be the top one here. You'll find a link in the description for a detailed analysis. But just to mention it briefly, here is the gist of it. Suetonius reports that the emperor, open quotes, expelled from Rome the Jews who, at the instigation of Chrestus, were constantly causing disorders. Close quotes. Now, the reason why this specific instance is still debated is because we don't know if this Chrestus is to be identified with Christ, so Christos, and it would just be a situation of a different spelling, or if it's a completely different person altogether. Some of the main points of discussion are the fact that Christus was indeed a name commonly given to slaves during the Julio-Claudian period. Also, the fact that from Suetonius' text, it seems to be an individual alive and operating in Rome. And 3, in another passage related to Nero's subsequent reign, Suetonius defines the Christian faith as, open quotes, new. So, one of the schools of thought when it comes to this specific instance is the idea that maybe this was a Jewish rebellion, but these disorders would not necessarily have to do with Christians. The opposite line of discussion is instead the idea that this is indeed followers of Christ, and in a way it was still Christ, even though it was after death, that would indirectly, with the doctrines and his followers, be causing trouble to the Romans. And this interpretation would be supported by the idea that sometimes Christians, Christianos, would be spelled with an E and read Christianos, which was an alternative spelling for Christians. Once again, for the details of this discussion, I would ask you to check out the dedicated video to Jesus' historicity. But the one thing that I would like to underline in this case is that from the point of view of ancient Roman authorities, at least at the beginning of the inception of the Christian faith, they did not distinguish them from other Jews. In other words, from the point of view of the Romans, Christians were just another kind of Jew, or just another kind of Jewish sect, at least at the beginning. The first actual persecution that we can identify historically carried out by the Romans against Christians appears in Tacitus and again Suetonius, who place it during Nero's reign, Emperor Nero. Tacitus in particular notes that the emperor blamed them for the fire that had struck Rome, initiating a persecution culminating in terrible tortures during which Christians were reportedly torn apart by beasts in the circus and burnt alive. I would say that if I were to ask randomly anyone who is watching this video right now to point out to one instance or historical example of the persecution of the Christians in ancient Rome, it would probably be this one. But did it happen? According to various hagiographers, the apostles Peter and Paul would have also met their deaths during the Neronian persecutions. This issue still remains debated among historians, but we do have two main schools of thought. Let's review both. According to one school of thought, expressed by Professor Brent Shaw of Princeton University in The Myth of the Neronian Persecution, Tacitus and Suetonius would project onto the events that occurred under Nero a greater perception of Christians and their incompatibility with Roman customs that were not yet in place at that time, but emerged later during the reign of Domitian and Trajan. Added to this will be the perception of the different parties involved. The memory of the Neronian persecution takes on apocalyptic characteristics in subsequent Christian sources because it was understandably experienced as a calamity, while, from the imperial perspective, Christians, still perceived at the time of Nero as a Jewish sect, would have been one of many uncomfortable and turbulent minorities, both for their refusal to sacrifice to the emperor's genius, but especially for the disorder they generated within the Jewish community of Rome. Essentially, according to Shaw, Christians would have been caught up in measured issues by Nero aimed at striking various minorities deemed responsible for disturbing public peace, but they would not have been persecuted as Christians. It should be said, however, that the current of thought expressed by Shaw remains a minority view, and most historians tend to give credence to the sources, agreeing on a persecution ordered by Nero, as reported by Suetonius, related to the, open quotes, superstitio nova ac malefica, close quotes, a new and malevolent superstition, as the sources describe Christianity, that distinguished them, and at most leaving in doubt whether this was effectively triggered by the desire to blame Christians for the responsibility of the fire, as Tacitus reports. And as a team, as we were preparing this video, we both agree with the latter. We do believe that it is more likely and plausible, having reviewed the evidence, that this persecution did happen and it specifically targeted Christians. Now, whether or not the numbers of these atrocities were increased by a sort of traumatic memory or not, difficult to say. So, did it happen? Most likely yes. Could some records have exaggerated it a bit? Also possible. We now reach the reign of Emperor Trajanus, or Trajan, and we are in the 2nd century. The epistolary exchange between Pliny the Younger and Emperor Trajan offers precious data regarding the perception and management of Christianity by the Roman state in the first centuries of the empire. If, on one hand, the beliefs of Christians are branded as, open quotes, excessive and depraved superstitions, close quotes, their interrogation through torture is reported, and their refusal to honor the emperor's genius was punishable by death. However, at the same time, it is evident that there were no specific laws promulgated against Christians, and the policy expressed by Trajan indicates that they were not actively persecuted. On the contrary, the emperor explicitly declares that they should not be actively sought out. In Latin, open quotes, conquirendi non sunt, close quotes, but that one should proceed against them only if they are denounced, but not if this happens anonymously. In other words, at least during the reign of Trajan, if Christians were specifically and openly defying imperial authority, then they would have proceeded to persecute them. But there was no specific hunt for Christians to take them from their homes, to take them from the streets, and persecute them directly. So if we compare it to Nero's persecution, Trajan ones seems to be less acute. The impression that emerges is that if expressly confronted with practices deemed illicit, such as the refusal to sacrifice to the emperor's power, the imperial authorities acted so as not to appear weak and to not create a precedent, but that Christians were not considered particularly harmful or dangerous. What emerges for Trajan's response is the desire to preserve order and public peace, and the awareness that actual persecution, aka searching out and flushing out Christians, would have been more conducive to disturbances than leaving them relatively in peace, going after them only when expressly denounced by someone who would have had to expose themselves personally. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content, and at the same time you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Now, this specific policy that has been expressed by Emperor Trajan is one of the elements that casts doubt onto the dating of the martyrdom of a specific saint, Ignatius of Antioch, during his reign. You see, Ignatius, whom, according to the usual retelling of the events, was brought to Rome in chains and condemned ad bestias, so to the beasts, had become, after Peter and Evodius, the main reference point of the Christian ecumen. The corpus of Ignatius' letters, written in captivity during his journey from Antioch to Rome, are generally considered authentic, and the entire story of the saint will be confirmed by Eusebius of Caesarea. But their dating is far from being confirmed, and could be subsequent to Trajan's reign. A much stronger and more intense outbreak of actual anti-Christian persecution is associated with the reign of Marcus Aurelius, in response to the difficulties that began to rage over the empire, from the economic crisis to famines and barbarian invasions, specifically of the Marcomanni, all elements that led to a state of generalized tension, ideal for the search for a scapegoat. Exactly like the Jews in the Middle Ages, Christians became the target of the most horrible rumors, which presented the Eucharistic rite as a sort of demonic Sabbath, a licentious orgy in which a newborn was killed and cannibalized, following a misunderstanding, probably intentional and conscious on the part of some, of the Eucharistic rite. Emblematic is the oration of Marcus Cornelius Fronto, of which Minucius Felix reported some passages. Let's read them. Open quotes. They, gathering from the most ignoble dregs, the most ignorant and womenfolk, easy to fall for due to the weakness of their sex, form a band of impious conspiracy, which meets in nocturnal congregation to celebrate sacred vigils, or in human banquets, nor for the purpose of performing a rite, but for wickedness, a race of people who love to hide and flee from the light, are silent in public and talkative in secret. They equally despise altars and tombs, mock the gods, scorn sacred rites, miserable. They pity the priests, if it is permissible to say so, despise dignities and the purple robes, they who are almost naked. Unbridled licentiousness reigns among them, almost like a cult, and they call themselves indiscriminately brothers and sisters, so that, under the cloak of a sacred name, even the usual immodesty becomes incest. I have heard that they venerate, after having consecrated it, the head of a donkey. I don't know for what futile belief. Others tell that they venerate and adore the genital parts of the same celebrant and priest. And those who tell us of a man punished for a crime with the highest torture and the wood of the cross, which constitute the mournful substances of their liturgy, attributes essentially to those criminals, broken to every vice, the altar that most suits them. This is a reference to Christ. Continuing. A child sprinkled with flour to deceive the inexperienced displaced before the neophytes is killed. Horrible to say. They then eagerly suck his blood, divide his limbs among themselves in competition, and with this victim they forge a sacred pact. Their banquet is well known. They cling together in the complicity of darkness by lot. This is probably a striking example of the sort of rumors, lies, and prejudice that some Romans were trying to cast through the people, so that they would form an image of darkness in connection with the Christians, of people full of secrets, cannibalistic and immoral, therefore depicting Christians in an increasingly malevolent light as fanatical, cannibalistic, incestuous, and orgiastic, made them the ideal target for popular discontent. And the persecution of the second half of the 2nd century AD typically seems to begin as spontaneous movements, which only later saw the intervention of authority. At the turn of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, during the reign of Septimius Severus, a law was promulgated specifically targeting Christians, but also Jews, and as such denying them the possibility of making proselytes, as can be inferred from the Historia Augusta, which states, open quotes, Judaeos fieri sub gravi poena vetuit, idem de Christianos sanxit, close quotes, which translated as, he forbade under severe penalty conversion to Judaism. He established the same concerning Christians. Close quotes. A further restriction was given by the Edict of Decius, which established the obligation to publicly sacrifice to the gods and to the emperor's genius, and led to the creation of the so-called libelli, certificates attesting participation in public rites. We do not know what the penalties were for those who refused to sacrifice, but it is likely there was imprisonment, forced labor, and in some cases, death. Throughout the 3rd century, the situation of Christians fluctuated, and periods of more or less explicit persecution persecution, such as those of Decius and Valerian, alternated with periods of tolerance, as it happened under Aurelian. The urgent need to empty the prisons emerges from what Eusebius reported, according to whom, in this situation, rather than carrying out massacres, most Christians were forced to sacrifice, even if only symbolically, so that even if involuntarily, it appeared they had renounced their faith. On the other hand, Diocletianus exploited these symbolic abjugations to spread suspicion and discord among Christians themselves, and in general his edicts seem aimed at striking the organizational structures of the Christian church, destroying their meeting places and scriptures, and beheading the hierarchy of the clergy. The edict ordered the sacred writings to be handed over, to remove from office those who held public positions, and to deprive of freedom members of the imperial palace, particularly freedmen and eunuchs, if they persisted in professing the Christian faith. Following the edict, 2 fires broke out in the imperial palace in Nicomedia, perhaps arson, perhaps due to natural causes, and in the east some revolts erupted, albeit ephemeral, even among the ranks of the army. In response, Diocletian hardened his position, and this first persecutory edict was followed by others. The second edict, issued between spring and summer of 303, required that throughout the empire members of the clergy be imprisoned and forced to perform sacrifices to the gods and to the imperial genius. Soon, however, the situation became difficult for the emperor himself to manage, and the third edict, promulgated on the 30th of November 303, evidently sought in some way to remedy the overcrowding of prisons caused by previous edicts, offering freedom to those Christians who had been imprisoned if they sacrificed to the gods. This is the time when we reach the 4th century and the beginning of the Great Persecution. The most incisive and unequivocal persecution that occurred during the Roman Empire materialized relatively late, in the early years of the 4th century AD, by Emperor Diocletian, or Diocletianus, an emperor aimed at restoring all traditional aspects of Rome, including religion. Diocletian, in common agreement with the Tetrarch Galerius, moved explicitly against Christianity and Manichaeism, 2 new religions that shared several aspects, progressively sanctioning them. From Lactantius and Eusebius, we learn that on the 23rd of February 303 AD, on the occasion of the Terminalia festival, by order of the emperor, the Praetorian prefect, followed by some commanders, military tribunes, and treasury officials, broke into the church of Nicomedia, located near the imperial residence, forcing the doors, burning the sacred book found there, and looting the furnishings. The building was then completely demolished by the Praetorians. Probably the choice of the day was not coincidental, as it seems to emerge in Lactantius, who suggests that they almost wanted to put an end to the religion of Christians. The god Terminus, to whom the Terminalia were dedicated, presided over limits and boundaries, the legal definitions of area of competence. The following day, an edict was publicly posted and subsequently spread throughout the empire, with which traditionally we officially mark the beginning of the actual strongest persecution against Christians. The edict ordered churches to be razed to the ground, sacred texts to be handed over and destroyed by fire. If in past centuries persecutions against Christians had been part of a broader operation aimed at persecuting the unwanted, punishing those deemed lacking in civic sense, or seeking scapegoats on which to vent popular discontent, now it is evident from the approach just discussed that Christians are considered by imperial leaders a politically dangerous enemy to be eliminated. At the beginning of 304, between the end of February and the beginning of March, a 4th edict was finally issued, and it appears evident that if previously Diocletian had tried to contain bloodshed and strike surgically, now he wanted to strike all believers indiscriminately. The edict required everyone universally and in every city to offer sacrifice and make libations to the gods. According to Eusebius, refusal to make sacrifices resulted in harsh penalties, torture, and execution. Several historians have spoken about this, and from the analysis of the sources, it seems, however, that the edict had an uneven application throughout the empire. In the West, only some of it was applied, and especially when it comes to Flavius Valerius Constantius, one of the emperors during the Tetrarchy, father of Constantine I. He seemed reluctant to apply subsequent edict thoroughly. This is probably due to the different perception of Christianity in the western part of the empire, where it was less widespread and with less political weight, and probably also interpreted according to the less intransigent currents compared to the eastern ones. The difference is evident in the documentation that emerged relating to the trials of Christians, and if in the east methods of abjuration imposed were, for instance, burning incense or sacrificing an animal, in honor of the gods, both cultic operations. In the West, Christians were simply required to perform traditio, in other words, handing over sacred texts and vestments, which was evidently a more feasible compromise compared to celebrating rituals in honor of other deities, at least from the perspective of Christians. Again, in the East, the darkest pages of persecution would occur, and Maximus Daia, successor to Galerius in the office of Kaiser of the East, would have strengthened in the provinces controlled by him the fourth edict, extending the obligation to sacrifice to the gods to every woman and child. The rise to power of Constantine and Maxentius in the West, however, undermined the power of balance of the tetrarchy desired by Diocletian and Galerius, and the new emperors clearly relied on the Christians to secure their own position, guaranteeing them protection and room for maneuver. Given the upheaval of the balance of power, to prevent Maxentius and Constantine from magnetizing all Christians as a striking force, it would be ironically Galerius in 311 AD who ended the persecutions with the Edict of Serdica. The Edict of Serdica, which allowed Christians to return to celebrating their rites as long as they did not interfere with public order, would be followed in 313 by the Edict of Milan by Constantine and Licinius to end any religious-based discord, guaranteeing freedom of worship to the citizens of the empire. Open quotes. We, therefore, Constantine Augustus and Licinius Augustus, having met profitably in Milan and having discussed all matters relating to public utility and security, among other provisions that seemed in many regards in accordance with the good of the community, decided with preference and priority to regulate what concerns the respect of honor of divinity, so that Christians and all men are allowed the freedom to follow the religion they wanted, so that every divinity and every celestial power could be propitious to us and to all those who live under our power. Close quotes. This edict will not only sanction the end of the persecution of the Christians, but the very beginning of their rise, which, as we now know, will culminate with the entirety of the empire becoming Christian.